Hi there. Today I wanted to talk about one way that we can feed Earth in addition to feeding ourselves, and that is through composting. And Earth provides so much for us and everything we need, not only to feed ourselves, but to continue to grow things and to care for our lawns and gardens around that without adding chemicals. And one way to do that is to return what we take from Earth back to the soil. When we grow one species at a time, we tend to um, deplete the certain nutrients, and so we have to then add them back as chemicals. Um, so by maintaining diversity and returning what we take from the earth to the earth, then we can keep the ecosystem vibrant and healthy. Um, I'm actually pretty fanatical about recycling, so I have very little waste that tends to go out in my trash. And so the bulk of what does go into my trash can has been vegetable scraps. And I gave up meat, pork, and beef and chicken. Um, so, um, so I really have most of my waste is really in the form of vegetable and plant matter. Um, like gardening, I've been sort of hopeless at composting. I had a previous attempt where I bought a big tumbling compost bin, and that just turned into this big ooey gooey mess. Um, and I never really got anything out of it and eventually broke. So I just kind of gave up on that. But now that I'm wanting to um, be in this relationship with Earth where I'm taking care of Earth and giving back, I have to rethink how I compost. And now I live alone. I don't have the family I had when I was last time I tried to compost. And I wanted to have a composting system where I could keep adding to it. A lot of the procedures they have online are for batch composting. So you get a great big mass of scraps, you let it sit for 3 months, and voila, you have compost. But uh, first of all, I don't have that much at one time to begin with, and secondly, I want to keep adding to it. So one of the friends of the foundation recommended a milk crate composting system. So it's basically 3 milk crates where you do 3 mini batches of composting. I'm using that process. There's my dog, and you can see that there's 3 milk crates, and I lined them with this black weed block fabric. And what you do is you put a month's worth of compost in the first bin. Hey, honey. And and then when that starts to ripen and get full, then you move it down to the second spot, and then you add to the top. And then a month later, you move that to the bottom spot, and then put the empty crate up here. And I have a lid on it to keep critters out because I am in an urban environment and I don't want rodents and things in my yard or in my neighbor's yard for that matter. And I just have a little tile here to weight it down. I kind of like it. It looks like a little pagoda. I think it's kind of cute here among my fence. And so I want to I don't want the scraps all over my yard. And I do live in an urban environment, as I said, where my neighbors are just right there. You can see my neighbor's house just on the other side of the fence. So what I do is I bought this little countertop composting container, so I just leave that on my countertop. And I bring my tongs with me because I try to turn my compost at least once a week. And I'll just show you what it looks like. I started this 2 months ago. I put the empty bin on top because I'm transitioning over to a new bin. But this is what I just added to the compost this morning. So it's my kitchen scraps. And they tell you to, every time you add kitchen scraps, you add some leaves and things to it. And fortunately, I have lots of pine needles. I add pine needles every time I add kitchen scraps to it. But this is what the 2-month compost looks like. It's a little dry, and so I usually have to add a little water to it, and I try to turn it like this. But kind of hard to see, but on the bottom it's looking kind of browner and softer, and I think this reflects that I've just not really been watering it enough. And I've heard of people watering compost before. Actually, yeah, at the bottom, it really just looks like some rich dirt. Um, so I'm going to stir this some more and add a little more water, and I'm well on my way to my composting. Whether this will be ready to put in my garden in a month remains to be seen. I suspect that it's not quite ready, it being too dry. But I'm in no rush. We'll just let it incubate along. So I hope you'll be inspired to start your own composting system, and that our accompanying segment, visiting the Field Station Farm, will be educational and informative, and I know it was inspiring to me to see how this happens on a large scale. And if you don't want to do your own composting, maybe there's a composting service in your community too, where you can have those scraps sent off and you can get somebody else to do the work of composting. So take care, and happy feeding Earth to you, and I hope you're feeding yourself too. Hi, we're here at the Field Station Farm learning about composting with Jessie. So we're in Jessie's composting field. So Jessie, why don't you walk us through a little bit of what you were just telling me about your raw compost piles and how yard waste and food waste becomes garden gold.
So what we do is we bring in raw material from the community. That can be anything from leaf material to mulch, soils that aren't being used by customers or anybody for that matter. And we put it in that pile right there.
Let's just spin around so people can see.
And that pile is then aged for anywhere between, on the short end, 6 months, on the long end, 14 months. And when you age material, you grow a lot of fungus in the material, beneficial funguses. You grow a lot of bacteria that are really beneficial to the composting process. And then you move that material, we'll move it over here to these rows where we use our composting. It's a machine called a windrow turner. And we run that windrow turner through the material to aerate it. And we can look at these piles and you see the difference between where the material starts in that pile and where it ends up here, and the color difference, the texture difference, and also the usability. That material over there is very unstable. You can't use it for much. It's raw. It has a lot of nutrients in it, but what we have to do is turn it into something that we can use a shovel or a machine to move around and put back into the earth. So that's what the composting process does, is it takes our waste that's otherwise just being discarded and burnt or put into a landfill, and it brings it and creates a product that we can actually use to add value to the soil, which is generally depleted in most cases.
It's so beautiful. It's so dark and rich looking. I can just see how things would just love to grow in that type of medium.
Yeah, the color is really important. The color lets us know that it's carbon dense. It lets us know that it's broken down, and it lets us know that the material is stable. So the darker and darker the material gets, the more stable it's become. And that allows us to have the confidence to grow something in it and know that whatever we put in there is going to live. And it does live. It lives really, really well in that material. So material at Field Station Farms is brought in from all over the community. Leaf material, lawn material, manure from various other farms, and food waste and recyclables from companies like Enrich Compost, who collect material from residents and then bring it to us where we compost it jointly. So this big pile of material right here is a very carbon heavy pile that's been collected and brought in from the community. It's going to sit in this pile and it's going to age, and it's ultimately going to turn into a finished product through the processes that we use here. And I won't go too deep into those, but it goes from that pile to another pile to these piles, and then we get a finished product out of it. So the material is really diverse. It comes from you find everything in there, all sorts of things that you never would expect. Tennis balls, things from people's yards, and that's really a positive thing because none of that stuff is then all of that waste is not ending up in a landfill. It's ending up here. We can turn it into something useful, which is really important.
And what's wrong with it ending up in the landfill? Why is that bad?
We're running out of landfill space. We should recycle whatever we can. This stuff is valuable. So not only from a monetary perspective, but from an environmental perspective, it makes no sense for mankind to take nutritive waste items and throw them in the trash. It makes a ton of sense for us to keep them and turn them into something that we can put back into our home, back into our community, and then ultimately back on our table where we can eat the fruits of that labor. It just makes a ton of sense. And methane gas production in landfills is really not good for the environment, and this eliminates that completely. There's not that component that exists anymore in the landfill because of this material. And if you look at the quantity of material, it's not that much that we do here, but if everybody would do this, you really could make quite an impact as far as how much material these landfills are required to take.
Yeah, so it's stuff that would just go into the trash, and you're using it not only to put nutrients back in your soil on your farm, um, and then thus reducing the need for you to pay money for synthetic fertilizers, right? That you can
Yes.
just put it back in the farm, so you're saving money, but you're also selling the compost too, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's economically sustainable and it's environmentally sustainable. And those two things have really got to go hand in hand with any enterprise. And to your point about synthetic fertilizers, not buying synthetic fertilizer saves us money, it saves the environment, and it also gives us the opportunity to build soil, whereas synthetic fertilizers actually damage soil. So with compost, we are building the soil slowly. With a synthetic fertilizer, you might get a really green field of wheat or a green lawn or what have you. But at what cost is that to the environment? And that's a whole nother discussion. But compost versus synthetic fertilizer, um, anybody who knows about agriculture knows that composting is the future of fertilizing land.
And is the main difference that the compost has a rich mix of nutrients as opposed to a fertilizer that only puts one or two ingredients back in? Is that
Yeah,
one of the main differences?
that's one of the main differences. Another main difference is that compost is alive. It's bacterially and fungally alive. The soil has a very diverse mycology system within it. That's fungus that lives within the soil. When we add more fungus to the soil, we grow the soil, we grow the connectivity. When you add synthetic fertilizer, you're adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the plant is growing and sucking whatever it can out of the dirt, and then that plant is disappearing and never coming back. And so you're robbing the soil bank over and over again with petroleum fertilizer. So it's
Oh.
just not sustainable.
Wow, that's profound. So you're saying that the soil is alive, and when you return compost to the soil, you help sustain that life and add to the life and the ecology of the soil. The soil has its own ecology that's important for good and healthy crop production, and I bet it's better for our the quality of our the food we grow, and better for Earth, right? It's a way of caring for Earth's soil,
Yeah,
Earth's land.
it's just copying natural systems that have worked on Earth for eons. Earth has always recycled its own carbon material back into the soil. The Great Plains of the United States is one of the most fertile soils in the world because buffalo ate the grass, left manure on the grass, built the soil content, built nutrients within it, made a soil web that was super complex, super old, super complex, and then we plowed that land up and created the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, destroyed the topsoil, used it as much as we could to grow wheat, and now we are backpedaling to re-engage carbon in that soil and to re-sequester all of the carbon that we lost during the rise and the continuation of industrial agriculture, which still exists to this day, although it is much miles ahead of where it was in the 1930s, of course. And it is improving, and compost is one big way that it's improving. So yeah, adding to the soil is important.
So we're working with nature, using nature's methods in a way that's sustainable for Earth, but also for us and our lives, feeding ourselves and our pocketbooks.
Yes, and
So
every way.
win-win, win-win all the way around.
It's totally a win-win. Yeah, it's very synergistic, very important, very synergistic, and compost is viable in basically every way: environmental, ecological, economical, and it's fun, it's pretty, and it smells good.
It's really pretty. It does smell really good.
Yeah, I like
You would
it.
think it would smell.
No.
So Jesse, can you just walk through the timeline of your compost process here compared to what it would be for me in my milk crate composting
Yeah.
system and others like me?
Sure. So if you're composting in your home, presumably you're taking that kitchen waste and you're putting it in a container, and then you're maybe taking it outside and putting it in a 3-compartment or 2-compartment system, or an aerating bin. There's so many ways to do it. Your material at home is going to be very nutrient dense. Food is very nutrient dense. It's very nitrogen rich. It's going to compost very quickly. It's going to get very hot very fast. So you can take raw waste from the kitchen and turn it into compost in a matter of weeks or months, compared to this material here. It's very carbon heavy, it's very cold, it's going to be much slower. This material can take a year to 14 months before we turn that into that finished compost. And there are advantages to slow composting and cold composting, but those are long discussions, and for the purposes of this video, understanding that in your kitchen, it does not take you long to go from a little bowl of what others would call trash to something that actually has a ton of value to your plants and your garden at your own house. So it's really cool.
And what do we need to know about turning the compost?
Turning compost is all about adding oxygen to the pile so that the bacteria that are breaking down the food eat and live and can breathe. You need to turn your compost pretty regularly, and there's a lot of information about that online and in various places. But essentially, you want to keep that compost warm so that it's active, and so that the bacteria in that pile are breathing anaerobically and breaking down all the various things you have in there: eggshells, broccoli stems, onions. Everything is being broken down into one black mass that can then be taken and put into your garden. Without air, you really won't get a whole lot of breakdown. So you need to turn that material so that the bacteria can live. And aerobic and anaerobic activity does occur in a pile all the time, because there's always some air in a pile, but you really do want to turn that material so that you're speeding up the process, giving that bacteria a way to operate efficiently.
And how often should I turn it?
It depends on what you put in it, but I would say every 4 or 5 days to every week. I would do it a lot. I don't see any reason not to. It's a long discussion, but you want that material to reach a spike in temperature and then start falling off before you turn it again. So you want to turn that material, let the bacteria come to life, start eating, and then right when they get about as hot as they're going to get, they'll cool off, and then it's time to turn again. And you want to keep that material sort of peaking on its temperature chart, and then gradually it will cool off as it stabilizes. And then when you start turning that material and you say, this stuff all looks the same, it's got a uniform texture, it all looks the same, that's when it's stable, that's when it's time that you can go ahead and put it in your garden, as long as you don't see any major irregularities in the material.
And this is true even if I'm continuing to add to my compost pile, right? I should just keep turning it.
You should. Yeah, you should keep turning it, and eventually you're going to have to take some of that material away. So you want to have a few different sections so that you're not putting raw material right into your finished compost. Otherwise, you'll you'll never complete the compost process. You'll
Mhm.
always have that raw material in there. So you do need sort of a break occasionally, either a break or a different area for your finished product. That's why we have our raw material here. Usually we have an intermediate pile right there, and then we have a finished pile right there. That's why we do it that way, because if we put that material in there, all of a sudden that material would have to compost again
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah. So that's my 3 chambers of my milk crate.
3 chambers. It's all 3 is the way to do it. Yeah, three chambers. That's the way we do it. That's the way most people do it. It's a good, really solid system.
And how does the turning compare to your system here? Like how often do you turn this pile?
This pile will only be turned 2 or 3 times in the course of an entire 12-month period. The reason for that is I like to get a lot of age on my compost. I like the fungal qualities and content of what's called a static aged pile. I get a lot more volume out of it. When you turn compost a whole lot, you're going to notice that you lose a ton of volume. Your bin number 1 over here might start with this much food in it. By the time it gets to number 2, it might have this much in it, and you might be left with this much finished compost. It can be as much as up to 90% reduction, which is fine, and it's still good compost. It's nutrient dense, but I've been doing this about 10 years, and I just like static piling this material. I like leaving it. I like letting it age because it gives me really good color, really good texture, and the material melds together so nicely. It's just part of my recipe. It's part of the way I like to do it, and it's also about timing too. I don't want to always have compost ready. I kind of want to stage it out so that in the spring I've got a lot of this black material that I can use for projects. I don't really want a ton of finished compost in December and January and February because I'm not really actively growing at that time. So works for me to do it this way.
Well, your recipe seems to be doing a fine job of creating a really beautiful product at the end, Jesse. Thanks for showing us around.
Oh yeah, thank you.